Good afternoon. I'm Russell Wooldridge of DRI International, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the latest in our ongoing series of webinars. With these presentations, our goal is to advance the knowledge and understanding of our certification and training programs. Today's webinar is ITDR and Business Continuity, Issues and Answers. Among the topics we will be discussing are the elements of an effective DR program, the responsibilities and training requirements of personnel involved, developing plans, and finding the right recovery solutions to match the needs of your organization in today's evolving recovery environment. You'll also learn about DRI's new ITDR training program, as well as the technology track featured at our upcoming DRI 2015 conference in San Antonio, Texas, beginning March 1st. Our speakers today are Bobby Williams, Director of IT and Risk Management at Fidelity Investments, Harley Lemons, Continuity of Operations and Service Continuity Planner for an agency of the United States Department of Defense, and Susan Rogers, CEO of Cyberwise CP. Additionally, we'll be joined by Gary Villeneuve, DRI Director of Education, and Buffy Rojas, DRI Director of Communications. We welcome your questions on this topic. Please use the question box, which in most cases is at the bottom of your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your question at any time during the presentation, and we'll address as many of them as we can during the question and answer portion at the end of this broadcast. Now, let's hear from our experts. First up is a familiar speaker on DRI webinars, Bobby Williams. Bobby is the Director of IT Continuity and Risk Management for Fidelity Investments. He has worked in the IT industry for 25 years in technical roles, vendor education, pre-post sales engineering, disaster recovery management, and business continuity management. He earned his BSEE degree from the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. He has earned his MBCP from DRI, chairs the DRI International Glossary Committee, and serves on the NFPA 1600 Emergency Management and Business Continuity Committee. Bobby, what should people keep in mind when developing and implementing a DR program in their organization?
Thank you, Russell. It's a privilege to be joining the webinar today. One of my first thoughts when DRI asked for input about a DR-focused training course was, doesn't everyone already have the knowledge necessary for DR? My second thought was, it's about time we thought about doing this. As I look back on my career in the IT field, I remember the Unix training classes that I attended before Al Gore invented the internet. Archie and Veronica were the search engines. UUCP was an acceptable communications method. 4mm DAT tapes were the rage in the backup world. A fundamental aspect of being a systems administrator was backing up data and ensuring that the data could be recovered. Of course, we kept the tapes right beside the Unix systems to allow us to get the data recovered quickly. Every week or so, a white-headed man would walk through on his way to the mainframe cavern, and he'd shake his head. He knew that the new kids in the data center had no idea what recovery was about. He went to the alternate site every 6 months with his truckload of mainframe tapes, his notebook full of cryptic and scribbled notes, and a suitcase full of moon pies. He was armed with the knowledge that he and he alone could recover the beast and get the company back up after a disaster. Single point of failure was his job security, and no one thought about recovery until the next DR exercise after his retirement ceremony. Now all they had to do was to decrypt the post-it notes and decipher the scribble commands in the notebook of tattered dreams. The problem was that DR was not a part of the normal operations of the distributed environments. DR was inherent in the mainframe mindset, but not fostered as a discipline in the new generation geeks playing in the sandbox. Technology and operational trends have really changed the way IT works. If DR is not ingrained in the company's applications development and deployment process, recovery is now a pursuit instead of a practice. Several years ago, I was consulting with a Fortune 100 company to help them get an automated backup environment working correctly. They had outsourced their entire IT operations, and it wasn't operating as smoothly as anticipated. A little while after I completed my assignment, someone from the outsourced company called me and asked me who I thought was responsible for DR at this company. During the conversation, I learned that DR was not part of the outsourced contract. It was time for the annual DR exercise, and no one knew where the DR plan was stored, who was authorized to be at the recovery site, who was responsible for paying travel expenses, or who was in charge during the recovery. The contract had absolutely nothing specified. Needless to say, a quick contract amendment had to be negotiated that greatly increased the profit margin of the outsource company. DR was not an integral part of operations at a Fortune 100 company. ITIL has helped in getting DR back into the operational procedures, but often companies approach ITIL with a buffet attitude, picking the desserts instead of the meat and potatoes. I was at a company that implemented ITIL, and they thought that having IT service continuity plans for every application was just too costly. That part was deferred until a later phase, and of course that phase never got funded.
Understood. Are there other advantages in having DR inherent in your IT operations?
That is a great question. When companies fund and implement DR programs, the new technologies get incorporated into an existing process. It isn't a matter of having to figure out a totally new recovery process, but how to add a new cog into an existing machines. Companies can integrate software as a service, SaaS, into an existing program. Recovery priorities for the SaaS applications get added to the list of other priorities and the recovery steps. The DR plans can also aid in understanding how the SaaS applications connect or interact with the non-SaaS environment. The technical analysis of the SaaS application will help everyone from the product managers to the technical support personnel understand the operational nuances. The technical analysis will also become a valuable tool to the risk management teams to see the security strategies in network connection schematics. The DR teams can bring so much more information to light about these new technologies and services.
Well, what does the ideal DR program look like?
It would be an active program and not an afterthought, funded, staffed, and managed like other parts of the operational staff. And it could be in information security or it could be in IT operations, but it just needs to exist. I would suggest 4 roles in a successful program, and some of the roles may be performed by the same person in smaller companies. The first role is the program manager. The program manager writes and maintains the DR policies, would be responsible for the program training and exercise calendar, manages the escalations with other departments, he ensures that the DR coordinators are complying with the DR program goals and schedules, would produce the periodic program status reports or the exercise summary reports, and the program manager would ultimately be the responsible person for the recovery operations and the order of recovery for individual applications. The next role is called the DR coordinator, and the DR coordinator operates as the conduit of communications with the application teams. The DR coordinator ensures that the application owners and the plan writers are keeping the documentation up to date and that the exercises are conducted per policy. The DR coordinator would ideally be moderating the discussions between the plan writers and the application or product teams. The exercise administrator ensures that the exercises are conducted per policy and coordinates the resources to conduct the actual exercises. The exercise administrator ensures that the exercises are included in the change management process, if applicable, and facilitates the exercises. The exercise administrator would analyze the applications involved in any exercise and ensure that safety steps were implemented to prevent contamination of data, or worse, a production outage that was caused by an exercise. The plan writer, or the DR subject matter expert, is responsible for the recovery plans of the applications or the infrastructure in the DR program. The plan writer ensures that the plans are kept up to date and executes the plans during the recovery operations or exercises. The plan writer would need to understand the steps to make the environment ready for an exercise. Some steps necessary for actual recovery may be impossible during exercise. These should be annotated in the exercise plans. The DR program would be responsible for the documentation of the application recovery time estimates or capabilities during the exercises or events. This time is necessary for validation of the business continuity recovery time objective, RTO, for the processes dependent on a particular application. The RTO is measured from the point of the incident or the outage. The application recovery time would be measured from the time, think stopwatch here, of the disaster declaration or the exercise initiation, measured to the time that the application verification or the acceptance by the product team. The BC program would maintain the RTO and the plan activation time. The plan activation time is further described in the ISO 27031 as the time necessary for assessments and evaluations that would lead to a disaster declaration. Only by adding the plan activation time into this equation can we compare the RTO to an application's recovery capability or estimate. Now, the ISO 27031 is the guide for technical systems recovery by the ISO community. While all this sounds complicated, it really isn't. A competent DR program should not be something that only gets visited when a customer or auditor asks questions. It should be a core part of any business in today's economy. In our complicated supply chains, we have to ensure that all the links are resilient. More and more companies are asking for their suppliers to share the DR documentation or to even participate in combined exercises.
Thank you, Bobby. Now we'll hear from Harley Lemons, a continuity of operations service continuity planner for an agency of the U.S. Department of Defense. Harley has worked in the area of continuity of operations for 20 years, focusing on ensuring mission continuity and critical functions of data centers. He is an MBCP, and as many of you might know, he has served in multiple volunteer roles for DRI International, including contributing to the development of DRI International's glossary of terms and the professional practices, as well as having been the past chairman of the Certification Commission for many years. Harley, please share your thoughts on developing and exercising an effective recovery process.
Thank you, Russell. I appreciate the introduction. What we're going to talk about right now is how we go about protecting and providing continuity for the service that we provide through data centers, through IT. From a basic standpoint, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to decide what the recovery process is. And that, from a high-level standpoint, is how we're developing the recovery process. But then once we develop the recovery process, there's an additional step that goes on, because if we develop a recovery process and it's developed by the experts who are resident in the data center at the time, then we end up relying on those people, and that creates a single point of failure. We get around that by taking the developed recovery process and then documenting it so that it's usable not only by the people who were the subject matter experts and able to develop the recovery process, but also by people who come along later and will have the responsibility perhaps to execute that recovery process as well. So we go from development to documentation. Once we've got things documented, then we have it so that it's usable regardless of the people involved. We're no longer reliant on individuals who could be single points of failure. But at that point, now that we've got a developed and documented recovery process, we're going to need to find a way to verify the effectiveness of those recovery processes and procedures. And we do that through exercises. And the exercise process will allow us to not only verify the effectiveness of those developed and documented recovery procedures, but it will also give us a chance to refine those recovery procedures, because no matter how good they were in theory, once you put them into practice, you're going to find areas where they could be made better. You're going to identify areas that maybe weren't considered during the development of the recovery process, and you're going to find opportunities for modifying the recovery process to reflect modifications to the actual production environment. So exercises give us the ability to verify the effectiveness of those procedures, as well as the ability to refine those procedures going forward. One of the other elements that we have to look at, though, and that isn't always considered when you're developing and exercising, is the concept of compliance or alignment with governing regulations. And there are regulations that determine what you're required to do, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. There are governing regulations, there are audit requirements, and so we have to make sure that we're going through and satisfying those requirements. So at a high level, you begin by developing recovery procedures. You then document those recovery procedures. Following that, you exercise the recovery procedures. And then at some point, typically after the exercise process has been in play for a while, you'll have to audit those recovery procedures. And by going through that approach, you will end up refining the recovery procedures again. And so it becomes a cyclical effort or a cycle that you go through. And the end result is, if practiced appropriately, you will have a recovery process that is refined through these efforts and is also modified so that it can be effective as your environment changes and as your requirements change. So let's look at the first step, the develop step. You begin with your objectives in terms of recovery. There are things that feed into that. In some cases, you'll have a business impact analysis that will tell you what needs to be recovered when. In some cases, you'll have regulations, especially if you're in the public sector, that will tell you that certain classes of applications have to be recovered at a certain time or within a certain time frame in terms of not only the recovery but the potential data loss. So you've got all these things that feed in and create an overall set of requirements or objectives, and you have to create a recovery process that meets or exceeds those objectives. Now, once you've done that, once you've gathered the subject matter experts together and decided that this is the appropriate approach for satisfying those requirements, whether we're talking about an entire data center, a complex of systems, or a single application, once you've developed that process, then you need to document that process so that you're not reliant on the subject matter experts who originally developed the process. You have the ability to transfer that knowledge through the documented recovery procedures onto the next generation of people responsible for overseeing that production environment. So, having these developed recovery procedures, you move into the documentation phase. Now, one of the things in my history is the reliance upon templates in terms of documenting recovery procedures. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, by having a standard approach, you're more likely to get documentation that fills all the requirements. But the other reason why you do that is because when you're dealing across an organization or an enterprise, by having a template-based consistent approach, you have a much easier learning curve when handing documented recovery procedures to somebody who is familiar with recovery, but not necessarily familiar with that particular application or set of applications. So, we begin with the development of recovery procedures by subject matter experts. We then move to documentation of recovery procedures so that they can be shared by the technicians who are capable of executing the recovery process even if they didn't develop it. Then we move into the next phase, the exercise phase. And this is where we go through recovery procedures or recovery processes and actually bring together subject matter experts, and in some cases go to the recovery site and execute those recovery procedures or walk through the recovery procedures. Now, there are two basic approaches that I have used in my history, and they are the tabletop exercise and what we call the simulation exercise. And there are many other exercise approaches that you can take depending upon your own environment. One of the things that we do is, especially when we're dealing with newly created recovery procedures, we will begin with a tabletop exercise. And the reason we do that is because we've got newly developed recovery procedures, and the tabletop exercise gathers together representatives from all of the elements associated with the recovery effort. So, if you begin from the first step of recovery all the way through the last step of recovery, everyone involved in the process gets to hear about the process from start to finish. And what that gives you is the ability to have somebody who is downstream in the process who can analyze steps in the initial stages of the process and can identify potential downstream negative impacts. Also, you have people who are listening to the very beginning of the process, and they can verify that what they understood the requirements to be are the same as the people in the middle or end of the process and their understanding of what the requirements were. So the tabletop allows you in a fairly short period of time to validate the underlying assumptions, to identify any potential gaps in the process, and then to, based on those results, to refine that recovery procedure so that the refined version is better than the initially developed version. Now, after that, we will typically move to an approach that we call a simulation exercise. And the reason we call it a simulation exercise is that we're taking the recovery procedures, we're taking the people who would be involved, and we're taking the actual data that would be used for recovery, and we're going to utilize the infrastructure at the designated alternate site for recovery and actually restore that application. The reason we call it a simulation, though, is because while we're doing that, we wall that environment off from the actual production environment. So we can accomplish a simulated recovery without impact to the production environment. And that's one of the things in my environment that is very important, that we reduce or, if at all possible, have no impact on production. And that may be important in your environment too. And so what we do is, through these two approaches, we take the positives of a tabletop and the negatives of a simulation, and then the positives of a simulation and the negatives of a tabletop, and we overlay them so that between the two, the pluses of one will counteract the minuses of the other, and the end result to the user is a better overall exercise program. Now, in your environment, you can use that same approach. There may be other exercise approaches that you will also use, and you can incorporate them in any way that fits or is appropriate for your environment. What I would recommend is, if at all possible, always use more than one exercise approach, because regardless of which one you select, there's going to be benefits to it, but there are going to be things that are negative associated with it in terms of its effectiveness in highlighting potential refinements to the recovery procedures or processes. So from our standpoint, it's always a good rule of thumb to have more than one exercise approach in your toolkit. Now, once we've gotten through the exercise approach, we now have recovery procedures that are developed, documented, exercised. One of the other things that we have to do is we have to make sure that we're in alignment with governing regulations associated with that. And like I said, on both the private sector side and the public sector side, there are governing regulations that influence how you conduct business and, to an extent, how you conduct a recovery effort or how you protect yourself in terms of situating yourself to be able to recover. Now, for every environment, it is up to the individual business or organization to determine what the governing regulations are. And then once you've identified what they are, then you will typically have either internal or external audits or both in order to come through and look at your program and determine whether or not you're in alignment with those overall regulations and guidelines. In the public sector, it tends to be regulations, it tends to be instructions that are published and are fairly straightforward. In the private sector, it may be very straightforward. It may require that you do a little bit of interpretation in terms of identifying the kinds of objectives and requirements that your program must meet. But once you've set those up, then you audit your program and you compare your program against those regulations. And if, for example, one of the very common requirements or best business practices is a regular schedule of exercises. In our environment, we conduct exercises on an annual basis for applications that have a recovery requirement. So from an auditing standpoint, when an auditor comes in, they will ask us for evidence that we have conducted an annual exercise. So we create post-exercise documentation that we can provide them that provides evidence of compliance. In your environment, you can do the same thing, identify what a requirement is, then you identify appropriate evidence to prove or indicate that you have met that requirement. One of the other ones in our environment is we have to pre-designate a recovery site for anything that has a recovery requirement. That site has to have certain qualifications. It has to be geographically separate. It has to be sufficient to host the recovery requirement. So again, when an auditor comes in, they will identify that requirement. We will provide evidence that verifies or indicates that we have met that requirement. In your environment, there are going to be similar things that you have to accomplish. And one of the things that's important is, as you're developing your recovery procedures, as you're documenting your recovery procedures, and you're conducting your exercises, it's important that you develop a compliance evidence approach along the way as well, so that, for example, you don't conduct exercises and then have no follow-on documentation that you can use to provide evidence of compliance. If you're developing recovery procedures and designating an alternate location for the recovery of those applications, then you should have some kind of documentation that says, for this application or these applications, this is the designated recovery site. So we have satisfied the requirement to pre-designate a recovery site. Now, once you've gotten through that portion of the process, you now have a recovery process in place that can be refined through exercises, that can be verified for compliance through your audit process, and is able to be transmitted to future technicians or personnel associated with the recovery process, because you have documented in some kind of format the recovery procedures, and they can be passed on to the next generation of technicians or the next generation of personnel who have that requirement to recover. And that means that you are no longer reliant upon the individuals who originally developed the recovery process, and they are no longer single points of failure in the event that they become unavailable to you in a recovery situation. So, again, when you're looking at fulfilling your recovery process or recovery requirements, you begin by developing a recovery approach. You then proceed to document that approach so that it's transferable. You then proceed to an exercise portion of the program so that you can verify the effectiveness of the recovery process, as well as you gain the ability to refine that recovery process as you're going through. And then you develop audit points where you can go through and verify that your program, whether it's recovery time objectives or exercise requirements, you can verify that your recovery program is in alignment with not only best practices, but it's also in alignment with the legal guidance and regulatory requirements that are appropriate for your particular industry or business sector. And once you do that, once you take care of those four elements, those four major elements, then you have a recovery program that in theory is effective, sustainable, and can be updated as your environment changes. Okay, Russell, I'll hand the baton back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Harley. Our next speaker is Susan Rogers. As principal consultant and CEO of Cyberwise CP, Susan uses business continuity, disaster recovery, vendor management, and information security practices to enhance cybersecurity resiliency. She's an MBCP and an instructor for DRI International. She is also an active participant in the National Institute of Standards public working groups on cybersecurity risk framework, privacy engineering, and cyber physical systems. During her 25-year career in financial services, she developed and governed areas of technology risk management, enterprise risk management, capital markets, and supply chain operations. Susan, what should students of DR training be most aware of?
Thanks very much, Russell. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about this topic. Technology resiliency skill set is in demand, and we need to train more people. It's as simple as that. This education needs to include all components of infrastructure and applications that impact the building and maintaining of resilient environments. What does this mean? I think there are three really important points. First, we need to teach the DR student all the pieces. Second, they need to understand partnerships. And third, I think is really interesting, I think it's so valuable, it's the need to have independent thinking. So, what do those things mean? So first, understanding where all the pieces fit. So a DR specialist needs to know the history of infrastructure and software and the foundational concepts to be able to make educated decisions. From my own learning experience, the best training tells you why you're doing something and why it makes sense. This means a DR specialist needs to understand data center strategy, infrastructure design, information security lifecycle, and change management. And where all these pieces fit together, they also need to know where the pieces stumble over each other and where they can go wrong. Students, they need to understand how change and release management can maintain integrity of DR strategies. When they understand this, they can build controls that know where important links to integrity are breaking. And that's really the essence of risk management. The second point to emphasize for a DR student is to understand key resiliency partnerships. Now, to design DR plans, to document and test these plans, a DR specialist really needs to gain the respect of a technology team, of the folks within those teams. And respect comes from knowledge, from curiosity, from an open mind. So where do we start? We start by understanding the roles and the activities of the technology groups, the network, the telecom, data center, backup strategies, system administrators, system architects, database managers, knowing identity access, and understanding the interconnections with the application teams. So all these roles should be understood in context to what they do to protect systems. How do they work together? Who are they dependent upon? When you build DR plans, you get to know these folks and learn the nuances between these teams. A DR leader is in a really good position to pull these teams together through plan building sessions, through testing, and by pulling these partnerships together for lessons learned from the actual events. So the key resiliency partnerships are not just infrastructure and application teams. We've talked about those just a few seconds ago. The partners include information security, vendor management, asset management, access management, the help desk, and change management. There are many more. A DR specialist is in a valuable position to see across all these interdependent groups. Like a physical supply chain, when you pursue system resiliency, you can see where these weak links exist and where they systematically break, where people challenges can threaten quality and plan integrity. If you really think it through, a DR and also a business continuity specialist can help drive maintenance controls that support other risk management activities and even information security and cyber risk controls. That leads me to the third point. Disaster recovery training is needed to achieve independent thinking and unbiased recommendations. Independent thinking comes from knowledge, and good independent thinking comes from broad understanding. DR education needs to include many different perspectives and trade-offs that exist in DR strategies. So a DR specialist needs to challenge all the products that come from vendors and see through the marketing and biased viewpoint, all the way to the basic activities and the value of that vendor technology. So there needs to be a healthy debate on DR solutions that include the strategic benefit, the short, the long-term benefits, include trade-offs of cost versus time, and the impact of that solution to different types of threats. It really is the broad picture that we're seeking in knowledge. DR training needs to give broad knowledge to help the DR specialist ask questions with confidence, but also with curiosity. Curiosity and more technical knowledge leads to the really cool stuff, and that is innovation. How do we solve the bigger problems? How do we flip from defensive resiliency to innovation, to innovative opportunity? That's the mindset that really makes an individual valuable, strategic, and not just in your employee role, but in your everyday way of looking at life.
Thank you very much, Susan. Now we'll hear from Buffy Rojas, DRI's Director of Communications. Buffy, what can you tell us about the technology track that will be featured at DRI 2015 in San Antonio, Texas on March 1st?
Thank you, Russell. I'm really excited to talk about this year's conference in San Antonio. For those of you who don't know, DRI 2015 will be held March 1st through 4th at the Wyndham Riverwalk in San Antonio, Texas. We're really thrilled to be there, and we have two exciting tracks for you this year, one in risk management and one in information technology. The technology track features a keynote opening session that sets the tone for the panel discussion and the working group session to follow. Bobby Williams, who you just heard from on this webinar, will be leading the technology track working group session. And for attendees with a deep interest in technology and ITDR and all things business continuity, this working group session is a must. Bobby is going to lead the session, facilitating information exchange and interaction among attendees while offering challenging scenarios and topics on which to base the discussion. Our working group sessions were a big success. In fact, both working group sessions went overtime. No one wanted them to end. So we're very excited to have one in technology this year. We know it's a hot topic among our certified professionals and the business continuity community, and we think it'll be a real service to all of our attendees. So you can visit our conference website at driconference.org. The technology track working group session will be facilitated by Bobby Williams, who you heard from earlier in this webinar. And for attendees with a deep interest in technology, ITDR, business continuity, this working group session is a real must. Bobby is going to facilitate the session, which will include an information exchange and interaction among attendees while offering challenging scenarios and topics on which to base that discussion. So we're very pleased to be able to offer a working group session facilitated by Bobby in technology. We know that it's a real hot topic amongst our certified professionals and the industry, and we're sure that the track and the working group session are going to be a big success and invite you to be part of that. For more information on the track, please visit the conference website, driconference.org. In addition to the technology track, we also have technology-related sessions in almost every time slot during the conference. The technology track will be offered on Monday, March 2nd. But every other time slot for sessions on Tuesday also will have technology-related content. We have two sessions in cloud technology, one which will discuss what really goes on in the cloud, how you make service provider decisions. Do service providers understand business continuity issues? What are the limitations of cloud recovery for DR? And how to develop and conduct a good exercise. We'll also be talking about cloud and big data and how business continuity is really now outside the enterprise and that it's a complex and intricate thing. We'll also have a case study in need for a speedy recovery. And that case study will cover technology such as virtualization, storage, replication, geolocation technology, alternate data center sites, and more. And lastly, we're thrilled to be in San Antonio because based in San Antonio is a world-renowned cybersecurity research center at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And we're lucky enough to have Dr. Gregory White, who's the director for the Center for Infrastructure Assurance and Security, with us at the conference. Dr. White's group represents a truly multidisciplinary approach to problem solving. The Institute for Cybersecurity conducts broad-based, basic, and applied scientific research in partnership with academia, government, and industry. In fact, San Antonio was the first city in the nation to conduct a mock cyber terrorism exercise. CIAS, Dr. White's group, is now recognized as a leader in cybersecurity testing. We hope to see you at DRI 2015 in San Antonio. And if you have any questions about the conference program, again, I invite you to visit our website at driconference.org, or please contact me at brojas@drii.org, or give me a call at 610-933-8746. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Buffy. The final speaker we'll hear from today is Gary Villeneuve, the Director of Education for DRI International. Gary, tell us what we can expect from the new BCP ITDR course we'll be offering.
Thanks, Russell. The BCP ITDR course is a 2-day class that will familiarize business continuity and disaster recovery professionals with the development and management of the information technology disaster recovery process, or what we call ITDR, as a subset of their company's business continuity management, or BCM, program. During the class sessions, there will be 11 group discussions, activities, and exercises. The participants will learn the role of ITDR within the BCM program, the issues involved with the recovery of technology platforms and data, current and new ITDR technologies, how to select strategic alternatives for the ITDR process, and how to develop, test, and implement programs and systems within their ITDR process, and how to integrate this process in their overall BCM program within their company. Some of the concepts and technologies that participants will learn are real physical environments, virtual environments, hyperconvergence, which is basically many vendors coming together to assist the company with recovery and continuity of their processing and network systems. Cloud computing-based strategies, co-location strategies, including hot site, warm site, and cold site options, virtual desktop infrastructure, or VDI, and as-service strategies such as data as a service, disaster recovery as a service, infrastructure as a service, IT as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And usually you'll see that with something like disaster recovery as a service is more like DRAAS. So you'll kind of see that AAS right behind that, whatever designator that is. And students will also learn about software-defined storage, network, and data center concepts. They will certainly learn new terminology, but the participants in this class will also learn how to create an ITDR project plan and gain management approval for the project plan. They'll learn how to use the risk assessment and the business impact analysis to help them do their ITDR planning. They'll be able to select cost-effective ITDR strategies and how to develop and publish ITDR plan. Now, who should be in this class? Business continuity and IT professionals, including IT security, CIOs, CSOs, CTOs, and others interested or with responsibilities in ITDR.
Thank you, Gary. Now for your questions. Bobby, Gary, and I are happy to answer as many as we can in the time we have left.
And as it happens, Gary, you get the first question. Given that long list of things that you just said would be in the course, what are the general criteria in invoking a DR or a business continuity plan?
Yeah, basically, when we look at invoking what we would call business continuity, it's really basically three to five triggers that are going to cause a company to actually put together some kind of responses that going to enable them to continue their operations, which would include their IT infrastructure. And one of those criteria, of course, is does the expected outage, is that going to, or estimated outage, does that exceed established RTOs? In other words, during the business impact analysis, we define what the recovery time objectives are. The second criteria among the three generally accepted criteria are the impacts extensive and beyond the control of the organization. That could be anything from an event that occurs on your premises that spills over to neighboring organizations. It could even be involved with a mutual coming together of several organizations in normal operations, and then an event impacts all the organizations. And then the third generally accepted practice or criteria would be the estimated damage. Does it exceed some kind of threshold dollar amount, such as we have insurance coverage, we may have cash on hand, we may have readily liquidatable assets, and that estimated damage, if it exceeds that kind of what we would consider money on hand, then that would actually could cause us to invoke, or could be the trigger that actually starts the continuity process in motion. There are two other criterias also that are adopted by some organizations, and that would be if an impact, if it impedes an organization's ability to meet its mission or its what it's supposed to do as a company, then that might cause also a continuity response. And it could be that if an organization has very large customers and any one of them or more have impacts that might severely indirectly impact the organization, then that might also cause the organization or the company to invoke that continuity. Now, a lot of times you'll see that invoking of that continuity is usually called the disaster declaration. So those 5 basic criteria is what's going to cause a company to actually have to really initiate its continuity practices and mobilize its resources.
Okay. Well, that kind of leads into another question. And Bobby, how does an IT disaster, how do you check an IT disaster recovery plan to ensure that it's successful?
Well, Russell, the main thing you do with it to do that verification is you exercise it. You set your scenario, you set your program requirements around the test. Is it a tabletop exercise? Is it live data? Whatever it is, you start easy, and then you start progressively getting to more challenging exercises, to where some companies actually do what's termed a go and stay. They go from one data center to another data center and stay there. And then a time period later, they switch back to the other data center. So it depends on how mature the program is, like if an auditor, what the expectation of the difficulty. But it gets that down to, you take your plan and you test your plan, and that's your validation steps. Okay.
Well, you mentioned early in your remarks, you mentioned that if ITDR practices are not ingrained in the deployment, it turns into a pursuit. Can you give some insight on how to talk to senior leadership on how to ingrain a BCDR plan into the future?
Well, one of the easy ways is you show them some of the, like the geographical disasters like Hurricane Sandy, and some of the the heads of the companies, and say, would you really want to be up there explaining to all your customers why we're out of business? So when you get to the executive management level, if they don't get the fact that they have to have DR, you can show them some of the regulations. You can show them the contract requirements that they probably have requiring, if they're in somebody's supply chain, requiring that kind of due diligence to have the recovery plans in place and exercised. And as Gary alluded to, and Susan also, some of these companies in the supply chain, they're going to require you to test with them. So the executives have to get on board with the DR programs.
Okay, because you did mention that that vendors often ask for copies of the BCDR plan. What is your company's policy, or what are some company policies, Bobby, that relate to letting others know about your DR IT plan?
Well, and it's company specific, and it's also contractual specific. So some companies will have it included into their contracts and their supply management contracts. Some companies don't. When you start going back to looking at what's your company required to disclose, then you can go through and do negotiating in the contract management side of it. But that could be a big differentiator between you versus your competitor. Is you've got these things in place and you can show it and demonstrate, and you use it as part of your sales force as saying, look, we're way ahead and you won't have to worry about us not being there because our lights are always on.
Great. Gary, there's been a number of questions about that relate directly to both solutions and the course itself that we're talking about. A number of people have asked about recommendations for ITDR solutions. What do we recommend here at DRI?
Yeah, basically, DRI, we don't really recommend any specific vendors or any other kind of consulting firms or that kind of thing. But what we do suggest is that organizations should do that business impact analysis, and then really, to what Susan alluded to a while ago, really get creative, really be inquisitive, really try to determine what is the actual best fit for any kind of strategy. Our professional practices actually lists several different kinds of strategies. But what we suggest you should do is consider a combination of those strategies, whether it's a hot site vendor or it's another company that's offering colo services, or maybe it's a vendor that wants to take over the entire computing business line that the company has itself. And then from there, also as part of that, to develop an ITDR program. So it should meet the needs of the organization. It should meet the needs of being able to recover within stated RTOs and to be able to continue operation initially of critical functions, and then as time goes on, more and more functions.
There's another question here that we've gotten from a number of people asking some specifics about the ITDR course of training that we've been talking about. That will be a new DRI course that is specifically focused on this particular silo, if you will, of the BCP program. It does not, unlike our risk or our healthcare or other courses, this does not come with a specific certification. It's really designed as a refresher or a way to bring the new information and the new technologies that have presented themselves in this evolving world of ITDR as part of what you all do. It's a way of bringing you up to speed and making sure that everyone is absolutely current. Wouldn't you agree, Gary?
Yeah, exactly. And I think another thing to take away from this too, because we are gonna show students, basically how to put together that project plan that I mentioned, and how to actually determine what is it that we really need to be able to continue and recover our IT infrastructure in support of the business function. So exactly. I mean, we're going to go into more detail than you would say if we were just going through, maybe a half-day course. This is going to be pretty deep. It's going to have a lot of cloud computing oriented type of information in it. It's going to have some, really specific elements that need to be in an IT disaster recovery plan itself. And we'll even address at some level, something on exercises that Harley was talking about a lot, because if you have a plan, you don't exercise it, you don't have a plan. So, that we're going to even address that in our class.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that answer. The final question is along those lines. And Gary, the final question goes to you. With IT having such a wide berth with new technologies and existing technologies and the change and so forth, how do you go about training a DR team members when management views their role as DR and DR only?
Well, basically, they should be given some general concepts on continuity and recovery, because as far as their technology, their knowledge, their expertise, they have a lot of that already. And the organization should be picking individuals, out of their, whoever the employees are, that really understand, the processing and the, how it supports the business functions and the business units. And then give them the basic training as far as how to conduct an exercise, or how to actually execute procedures, and how to document results that they see in an exercise itself when they actually do the exercise. The idea there is with the exercise, certainly that's kind of a less stressful situation. But if they do that kind of training and exercises, then they will basically, they'll know. Hopefully, they'll know what to do, or they have a better chance, let's say, on performing those procedures more effectively than they would if they were not doing any kind of exercises and did no training whatsoever.
Thank you, Bobby and Gary, for answering our listeners' questions today. If you still have questions regarding ITDR that we didn't cover, or if you'd like to schedule training for yourself or your team, give us a call at 866-542-3744. A recording of this and all other webinars is posted on my DRI. I'm Russell Wooldridge, and this webinar has been a production of DRI International 2014, all rights reserved. Thank you for your attention.